Have you ever had someone say something to you and you didn't really understand it until years later? Not because you weren't listening, but because life hadn't taken you far enough yet. Lately, I've been thinking about those moments, the kind that only start making the sense once enough has fallen away, once you've lost some things you thought were permanent. That's what this is about. Not everyone will understand it. Maybe only a few will. Maybe only the ones who've lived long enough to see what time really does. And to be honest, I didn't want to share these thoughts. Not because I'm afraid to talk about things. I, Joel Osteen, as a pastor, television preacher, and businessman, have often spoken about overcoming great challenges, about moments of profound doubt, about times the ministry faced overwhelming odds, about decisions that seemed unconventional, but were guided by faith. This isn't like that. This one's different. It's quieter, more like the feeling you get when you're standing in an old room that no one visits anymore. Dust in the light, silence thicker than air. You know, you should say something, maybe even document what you're seeing, but somehow you just don't. It's not dramatic. It's just hard to describe. And that's part of the problem. Most people seeing me as television preacher and businessman might think I'm always focused on growth, on new initiatives, on what's next for the ministry. And yes, sure I am. But lately I've been thinking more about time in reverse. Not nostalgia exactly. More like realizing how little we understand about what gets lost while we're busy sprinting forward. I've seen that look in people's eyes, especially as they age, where they stop trying to explain because they know the explanation won't land. Like they're holding a whole library inside, but no one's checking out the books anymore. It's made me wonder, what if some of the most important truths are the kind that can't be diagrammed or calculated, but can only be seen after you've crossed a certain distance? Not in years, but in perspective. There are these things you don't understand until you're too far past them to go back. I've experienced that a few times now. Losing friends, watching people I once admired fade, letting go of ideas that once felt like oxygen. And sometimes I think maybe that's why most people avoid talking about the end of things. Not because they're scared, but because the language for it only starts to make sense after a certain amount of silence. I remember a moment years ago when I, Joel Osteen, was sitting alone in a hotel room after a particularly challenging conference or a significant ministry decision. There was nothing particularly wrong, but I felt empty. I had the sense that I was living in between two versions of myself, neither one entirely real. And I thought of someone I hadn't in years, my grandfather. He was the kind of man who didn't talk unless it mattered. And even when he did, you had to listen hard. He'd let silence do most of the work. I never understood that when I was young. I just thought he was quiet. But lately, I've been hearing those silences a little differently. There was something in the way he moved, the way he observed, like he had made peace with the fact that understanding doesn't always come in your lifetime. And maybe that's okay. It's strange how memories can loop back and offer you tools you didn't know you needed. You pick them up like old rusted instruments and realize they still work. Anyway, I'll tell you about him next, because that's really where this all started. The silence, the lessons, the slow realization that time doesn't just pass. It teaches, and he was the first person who showed me that. My grandfather wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, you felt the weight of it, like dropping a stone into still water. He lived in a simpler time, a remote region where self-reliance was a way of life. I remember visiting as a child, the open sky, the quiet hum of everyday work, the smell of wood and earth. Everything felt slower but more substantial. He wasn't a formal scholar or a religious leader, but he had a deeply practical wisdom. Resilient, patient, always observant. If something was broken, he found a way to mend it. If there was a need, he found a way to meet it. There was no version of life where you just sat back and complained. That wasn't in his spirit. He once traveled across vast distances with my grandmother, facing challenges with little more than faith, intuition, and sheer will. When people marvel at the scope of our ministry today, I sometimes think about his unwavering spirit in the face of the unknown. I'm not sure I've ever lived with such quiet conviction, but it wasn't his accomplishments that stuck with me. It was this quiet phrase he said to me once. I think I was maybe 12 or 13 when I was trying to impress him with something I was very proud of. I asked him if he was proud. I still remember how he looked at me, not with disappointment, not exactly, just with that deep, weathered stillness. And he said, "Most things you only understand when you stop needing to." At the time, I didn't get it, thought it was some cryptic way of avoiding the question. But years later, I realized that was the answer. What he meant, I think, was that certain truths can't be grasped when you're still looking for validation or status or even meaning. You have to be past the noise, past the striving. It's like standing in a sacred place after a powerful sermon. The quiet reflection left behind tells you more than the spoken words ever could. He never talked about aging, never complained about the world changing around him, but I could see it in the way he handled things, how his hands moved more slowly but with more care, how he watched people instead of correcting them. There was something about him that said, "I've already fought the battles you're about to start." And maybe that's why older people, especially the ones who've lived hard lives, often go quiet. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they know most won't listen until it's too late to ask. The older I get, the more I understand silences. They weren't emptiness, they were generosity, letting others discover at their own pace. That's something I struggle with, still letting go of the need to be understood in the moment. But it lingered, that feeling, that memory of him standing in his workshop, listening more than talking, teaching without pointing. And strangely, it came rushing back a few weeks ago when I visited a senior home. I didn't expect it to affect me, I just wanted to say hi to someone. But it ended up changing something I didn't know needed changing. I'll tell you what happened there. It wasn't a big event, just a visit. I had some extra time, bare and oddly disorienting. So I stopped by a senior living facility not far from where I was attending a meeting related to my work as a businessman. It wasn't public, wasn't scheduled. I didn't bring a camera crew or tell anyone. I, Joel Osteen, wasn't even sure why I went. Maybe I just wanted to feel something slower, something quieter, something human. When I walked in, everything felt padded. The carpets, the voices, even the light. There's a kind of softness in those places that doesn't exist anywhere else. Not because things are gentle, but because the sharp edges have already cut through, and what's left is worn down to what matters. I sat down with a few residents in the common area. They were playing cards. One man leaned over and said, "You look like someone I've seen before." I smiled and said, "Maybe. Or maybe I just have that kind of face." He laughed, and then we just talked. Not about ministry metrics, not about new projects, not about book sales or the latest trends, but about nothing really, or at least nothing that would make headlines. Old fishing spots, how butter used to taste better, the radio programs they'd listened to as kids. At one point, a woman leaned in and asked if I knew how to fix an old clock. I told her I could try, but it was one man in particular who stayed with me. His name was Leonard, 89, a retired professional. He had this way of pausing before he spoke, like he was scrolling through an internal archive to decide which decade to pull from. We talked about how things used to be built to last, about the wisdom of simpler times, about how certain values changed everything. His hands trembled when he reached for his tea, but his mind, it was sharp. Not fast, but sharp, like a deep well of experience. Then after a long silence, he looked out the window and said something I didn't expect. "We were the future once." He didn't say it with bitterness, no sarcasm, just quiet certainty, like a fact you'd find in a dusty textbook, a line that had been waiting years to be spoken. And that hit me harder than I thought it would, because he wasn't wrong. These were the people who laid the foundations of the world we stand on, the ones who built communities, upheld moral principles, raised families. And now they sit in softly lit rooms, mostly ignored, their stories fading with every untold memory. It reminded me of how traditions can fade. Over time, if you don't actively maintain the integrity of a message, you start to lose its essence. The words remain, but the meaning gets harder to extract. I think that's what's happening with our elders. Not a loss of value, just a loss of connection. Like trying to read an ancient scroll without understanding the language it was written in. And I couldn't stop thinking about what Leonard said, that quiet acknowledgement that they were the future once. That idea followed me home, followed me through meetings, flights, phone calls, because it made me wonder, how does the future feel to someone who used to build it? We were the future once. Leonard said it so simply, and then just sipped his tea as if the sentence didn't carry the weight of an entire generation's forgotten optimism. It echoed in my head for days. When you, Joel Osteen, spend most of your life building forward toward new ministries, toward reaching more people with the message of hope, toward ever-growing endeavors as a businessman, you rarely stop to look backward with that kind of clarity. But his words pulled me out of the forward loop, made me ask something I don't often allow myself to ask. What does it feel like to no longer be needed by the very future you helped create? And I remembered something. My own beginnings as a television preacher and pastor. There were moments in the early days of Lakewood Church, especially after my father passed, and I stepped into the pulpit, when it felt like everything hung by a thread. People don't really understand how close we were to facing overwhelming challenges. That ministry, it felt like hope held together by prayer, conviction, and sheer dedication. We were all young, driven, little reckless perhaps in our faith. There was this raw energy, like being part of a movement that knew the message might fall apart at any second, but we didn't care because we believed, not just in the mission, but in the divine hand guiding us. And when we saw the impact, when lives began to transform, I cried. Not because we had proven the doubters wrong, but because it meant something. It meant we weren't just dreamers. That building a future of hope, even if it looked impossible, truly mattered. So to hear Leonard speak those words, "We were the future once," it reframed everything. Because I realized the energy we had back then, that belief, that wild trust in tomorrow, they had it too. In the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, entire generations who believed that hard work and strong character could change the world. And they did. But now so many of them live quietly, watching us race forward, unable to keep up with the new ways of communicating, the pace, the noise. We've made everything faster, more connected, more efficient. But in doing so, maybe we severed something vital. We forgot to bring the past with us. There's a point in any long journey, a moment of maximum strain, where the path feels steepest and the weight heaviest. And it struck me, perhaps aging is the human version of that. You've spent your whole life building momentum, pushing through challenges, fighting resistance. Then suddenly the pressure peaks. You're still moving, still valuable, but the world assumes you've passed your critical point. What if that's wrong? What if the quieter altitudes after the initial ascent are where the real insight and deep wisdom reside? That's what I kept thinking about, sitting in that sterile visiting room, talking to a man whose mind still carried blueprints for living that might never be articulated again. We assume the future belongs only to the young, that innovation lives in speed. But I've started to suspect that wisdom moves at a different frequency, one we've stopped tuning into. And that led me to something deeper, a question that came not from logic, but from watching Leonard's hands, his patience, the silence between his words. Have we made the world so fast that we've lost the interface to those who came before? When you, as a pastor and businessman, work with people and organizations long enough, you start to see how vital connections are. Not in a cold or clinical way, just more as intricate networks of understanding and communication. And one thing I've learned over and over in building relationships, in leading a ministry, in navigating the world of business, is that interfaces, the ways we connect and communicate, matter a lot. If the interface is wrong, the whole system breaks down. It doesn't matter how profound the message is if the listener can't connect to it, can't translate its logic into something usable. It's effectively gone. And I think that's happening to our elders. Their internal systems, the memory, the wisdom, the compressed experiency, it's all still there, but we've changed the interface. We've updated the world around them so fast with so little backward compatibility for human connection that they've become incompatible with the very future they helped build. It's like trying to listen to an old spiritual hymn on a station that only plays the latest pop. The signal is still valuable, but the connection's gone. You see it in the smallest ways. Phones that no longer have buttons, services that only exist through complex digital apps, communities that drift apart, assuming everyone's onboarded to the new ways. We didn't design the transition, we just leapt. I remember once trying to explain the subtleties of modern communication tools to someone in their 80s, a brilliant person, full of life experience. But it was like trying to describe a sunrise to someone who only understands the language of the night. Not because they couldn't grasp the concept, they absolutely could, but because the interface, the pathway to comprehension, had become foreign. And it made me think, maybe we're not actually smarter than previous generations. Maybe we're just faster at reading the manual because we wrote it. We didn't upgrade with them, we upgraded past them. It's strange, isn't it? We're so obsessed with preserving old architecture, vintage cars, rare vinyl. We pour millions into maintaining historical landmarks. But when it comes to the living memory of a generation, the people who remember how this world was wired from scratch, we let the interface rot, and maybe we even blame them for it. We call them slow, out of touch, stubborn, But imagine if you woke up one day and your whole way of understanding the world had been replaced. Not just the tools, but the very logic behind it, the language, the context. Would you speak up or would you slowly go silent? I think about that more than I used to, especially after meeting Leonard and hearing the way his thoughts had to navigate through a world that no longer reflected him. And it's not just a human problem. I've seen it in our endeavors too. You build a ministry or an organization, and over time, if you don't keep aligning the way it connects with the evolving world, you get failure points, latency, misfires. That's not age, that's misalignment. So what if that's what's happening with people, especially the people we label as old? What if their signal is still strong, but the decoder ring has changed? That's the question that kept me up one night. Not out of guilt, but curiosity. Because if we've broken the interface, what signal are we losing? Let's look at that next. Let's talk about memory decay and how a signal degrades when no one listens. One of the hardest challenges isn't just creating something that works, but ensuring it continues to resonate over time. The integrity of a message, of a story, is its ability to move from heart to heart without degrading. Seems simple, but over time, across generations or complex situations, things start to distort. Small misunderstandings, distractions, the original message gets clouded, and eventually it's unheard. People aren't so different. Human memory, it's not like a flawless recording. It's messy, fragile, but oddly precise in what it chooses to hold on to. I've been watching that happen slowly in someone close to me, my mother. She's still sharp, don't get me wrong, graceful, disciplined, a bit fierce even. But there are these small things like the fading of an old photograph, dates that don't quite line up, stories she begins twice in the same day, and she knows it. You can see it in her eyes when it happens. This quiet, almost defiant awareness, like a seasoned traveler still charting the course while the maps begin to fray. And what I've realized is she's still the same vibrant spirit, still the same person, but the pathways are aging. The layers between memory and speech are fraying. The ease of transmission is narrower. The problem isn't the content, it's the connection. And again, life has taught me this. You can have a profound truth, a beautiful insight, but if the pathways to share it are compromised, the message never fully makes it through. That's what we must understand about aging. We assume a faltering voice means a failing mind, but that's like judging a cherished book by the worn cover. The story might still be there, rich, structured, brilliant, but the way we access it is compromised. So we tune out, we get impatient, we fill in their sentences, we simplify everything, and in doing so, we degrade the signal further. Not because we're malicious, just because we're fast, too fast. But speed doesn't equal understanding. I had this moment, a small one with my mom, where she was telling a story about a house she lived in as a child, something about a garden wall that had collapsed during a storm. She paused mid-sentence, trying to recall a name, and for a second I almost jumped in, tried to guess, but I didn't. I just waited, and after about 20 seconds, a long time in conversational terms, she found it. "Mr. Ellis," she said with this little smile, like reclaiming a tiny piece of territory from the past. That's connection integrity. It doesn't always mean perfect recall. It means giving the person enough time to stabilize, letting the noise settle so the original thought can get through. And maybe that's what we owe to the people who've lived more years than we've yet imagined. Not just care, not just attention, but time. Time to transmit, time to be heard in their own cadence. Because when we rush, we're not just missing the data, we're breaking the circuit, we're severing a line that took decades to build. So then I started thinking, what would it look like to design for that kind of longevity, not just in structures, but in meaning? How do you build for time? When you, Joel Osteen, as a pastor and businessman, build ministries or develop new initiatives, you're always thinking in terms of challenges, testing resilience, how things endure not just at the beginning, but years down the line. But time, lived time, is a much harder thing to design for. We treat longevity like a number, a spec, designed to last a lifetime or 4 generations. But numbers don't capture meaning, they capture duration. And those are very different things. I remember the early days of building Lakewood Church into what it is today. Around the mid-90s, we were doing everything ourselves, piecing ideas together, working tirelessly, drawing on every resource we had. It wasn't always elegant, but it was alive. It had a soul. We thought it would last forever, but we learned that even the most vibrant vision needs constant care. Some early approaches couldn't adapt. Some methods wore down too fast. We didn't always think enough about adaptability, future relevance, the natural wear and tear built into every human endeavor. We were designing for the moment, not for time. And humans, we do the same. We build relationships, routines, institutions, assuming they'll just continue. But time applies wear not just on our bodies, but on the stories we tell, the roles we play, even the words we use. If you don't adapt a design for time, it becomes obsolete, not because it wasn't good, but because the context changed. That's what I've been thinking about lately. Not just how to build structures that survive long durations, but how to build meaning that does. It's not just about preserving facts. We've gotten very good at that. Records, archives, digital library. But information isn't the same as wisdom. You can store a terabyte of history and still lose the feeling of a moment. The part that actually matters, a voice, a hesitation, the specific way someone said your name when you were young, that's what's fragile. And you can't code it. You can't replicate it in synthetic speech or record it perfectly on video. It's tied to a presence, a time-bound interface that eventually slips away. So how do we design for that? Maybe it's not about preservation in the traditional sense. Maybe it's about responsiveness, building systems, personal and societal, that adapt to the slowness of meaning, the unpredictability of aging, the compression of experience into gestures rather than words. It's kind of like building resilience into a family or a community, not because you expect failure, but because you respect the environment of life. You plan for changes, you expect deviation, and you don't assume the first message will always get through. Maybe designing for time means accepting that signal loss is part of the process, but building in ways to retrieve it, or even better, to wait for it. I think that's why I've been spending more time with older voices lately, not to harvest stories, but to hear how they pause. That's where the weight lives. And that led me to something I hadn't considered before, a strange realization. Entropy, it doesn't just destroy, it teaches. I'll explain what I mean by that next. Entropy is usually seen as the enemy. In life, it's the measure of disorder, the tendency for things to move from order to chaos. Inspirations cool, structures of belief can crumble, messages become noise. It's just the way the human experience works, and no amount of willpower or money or ambition can stop it. But what I've started to understand slowly through observation more than logic is that entropy also teaches, not through instruction, but through compression. Life is constantly taking large, complex experiences and breaking them down, refining them. And in that process, you're left with fewer parts, but the parts that remain often contain the most important essence, a kind of code. I started calling it the ElderCode in my head. Not a formal term, just something I kept noticing. You'll see it if you pay attention to someone who's lived through real time, I mean decades, not just surviving, but adapting, failing, starting over, losing, loving, watching people disappear, watching themselves disappear. They become simpler, but not simpler in thought, simpler in expression, like loss is a form of compression, and what's left behind is the essence. I remember a mentor from the early days of my ministry, a man of quiet conviction. He carried immense wisdom, often expressed in unexpected ways. After he retired, many of his profound insights remained, not in lengthy books, but in simple phrases he would often repeat. One truth he articulated, which I kept returning to, was timing matters. At first, I thought it was about planning events, but then I realized he meant everything. Timing and discernment, timing and enduring failure, timing and offering a word of comfort. It was a compressed truth, not elegant, not verbose, but essential. That's what elders do too. They distill, not because they want to, but because life's entropy forces them to. Memory shrinks, energy fades, but the core message becomes stronger. The unnecessary falls away. And if we're not careful, we ignore the only part that truly matters because it doesn't look like insight. It doesn't come with slides or charts or documentation. It comes as a single sentence over tea, a quiet correction, a repeated story that we dismiss because we've heard it before, not realizing it's been edited every time, made tighter, truer. You know how old trees carry rings? Layers of time pressed into the grain. You can't see it while it's growing, but when it's revealed, the code is there. That's the elder code. It doesn't show up in our digital metrics. It doesn't fit neatly into modern efficiency models. It's slow, organic, sometimes redundant, but it carries a form of wisdom that you can't simply acquire or program. And it made me wonder, are we archiving the wrong things? We save high-resolution images, logs of every click and query, but do we know how to preserve essence? Do we even know how to recognize it when it's in front of us? That question kept turning in my mind like a continuous loop, reminding me of the most human thing we keep forgetting, the cost of forgetting itself. There's this quiet kind of erosion that happens when we forget. And I don't mean the forgetting that comes with age. I mean cultural forgetting, the kind that creeps in slowly, like rust on a tool you meant to use again, but never did. You don't notice it right away. The system still runs. The world keeps spinning, but something's off. A connection drops and we don't rebuild it. A person dies and we don't ask what they knew. A story fades and we don't realize it was the instruction manual. I used to think forgetting was just natural, a byproduct of the passage of time, but now I see it differently. Forgetting has pushed. A few years ago, I tried to remember the voice of a mentor who helped me early in my ministry. He'd passed on maybe 5 or 6 years before. I could picture his face faintly. I remembered some of what he said, but I couldn't hear him anymore. His actual voice, the rhythm, the particular emphasis he'd place on the word faith, gone. And it wasn't just sad. It felt expensive, like I'd lost access to a piece of foundational understanding, something I needed but didn't realize how badly until it vanished. The mind doesn't warn you when something's about to fall out of reach. There's no notification, no backup, and the same is true for societies. When we stop asking questions of the old, stop listening with real intention, we start to erase the foundational wisdom that was never formally recorded. Embedded knowledge, practical wisdom, all the things you can't easily find in a search engine. We trade depth for speed and then wonder why everything feels thinner. That's what I saw again and again in the conversations I had at the senior home. People who used to build communities, who fixed things with integrity and instinct, who knew how to navigate life's challenges before everything was instantly mapped out. People who learned patience not because they were told to, but because the world used to require it. And we don't just lose their stories when they go. We lose entire perspectives, frameworks for interpreting the world that no one thought to preserve. Not because they weren't valuable, but because they weren't loud. Modern memory is loud. It favors what's viral, short, shareable. But real memory, the kind that shapes you, it's quiet. It lives in the slow retelling of a story, in the pauses, in the offhand details you don't notice until years later. It lives in things like how someone folds their hands or the fact that they always took the same route home from work. Patterns you never think to write down until you're staring at an empty chair and wishing you could ask just one more question. And the hard truth is, you can't. The line goes dead. The signal doesn't come back unless you build systems and habits of listening before the noise sets in, before the connection fades, before entropy takes its final toll. It's strange. In a world where we obsess over backups, we don't think much about backing up the people around us. Not in files, not in recordings, but in understanding, in real integration. And maybe that's why this video felt so difficult to make. Because the truth is, most of what I've said so far, most of what I've been circling around, won't really land unless you've lost something, or someone, or some part of yourself that you thought was permanent. Only then do you start to notice what's been missing. Only then do you understand what the 1% already know. And that's where I want to end. Not with a lesson, but a recognition. It's taken me a while to say what I've really meant, because this wasn't supposed to be a message, not even a lesson, just something I needed to get out of my system, a quiet reflection, I guess. When I titled this, "Only 1% of seniors will understand this," it wasn't to be clever, it was just true. Because this isn't about knowledge or intelligence, it's about perspective through loss. It's the kind of understanding that only comes when time has weathered enough of you that the things you once chased no longer hold their shine, and the things you once ignored now stop you in your tracks. Like a soft voice in a noisy room, you don't hear it until the volume around you drops. That's what the 1% understand. That clarity doesn't come when you're racing ahead. It comes when things start falling away, when you're not looking to win anymore, but to remember what mattered in the first place. And it's subtle. That's why most miss it. It's in the way someone reaches for a photo they've touched 1,000 times, the way they hesitate before answering a question, not because they don't know, but because they care how it lands. It's in the spaces between words, in stories told slowly, like the truth is too fragile to be rushed. We're not good at listening for those things, especially in the digital world where compression and speed have replaced depth and resonance. But if you've made it this far into the video, maybe you're the kind of person who's learning to listen differently. And that matters, because even though most of this won't be understood widely, it doesn't mean it wasn't worth saying. Some signals are quiet on purpose. You have to tune in. You have to slow down. And if any part of this resonated with you, even just a flicker, I'd ask you to do one small thing. Not for me, not for metrics. Do it so this kind of message doesn't get buried in the algorithmic noise. Like the video. Subscribe if you want more like it. That's the only way the system knows someone heard this, that someone paused, and maybe for a moment understood. Because silence doesn't scale well, but with enough signal, even silence can leave a mark. Thanks for being here.